Hey, and welcome everybody to another episode of Decommerce Live. I'm Roy Bernheim. I'm one of the co-founders of Decommerce. And today we're going to bring a conversation live to the public that Sandy and I had started previously. And I'm really looking forward to see where this conversation is going, because all the conversations we've had so far have just been super interesting. So welcome, Sandy. And for everybody who doesn't know Sandy, which would be a surprise to me, but Sandy Khaund is the founder and CEO of Credenza. Welcome, Sandy. And please introduce yourself.
Thanks, Roy, and thanks for having me. And very excited to have this conversation as well. My name's Sandy Khaund. I'm the founder and CEO of Credenza. Just a bit of a background on myself. I'm sort of a split between the engineering side and the business side throughout my career. I've worked at a number of Fortune 500 companies like Intel, Microsoft, Turner Broadcasting, and Time Warner. I've also worked at a number of startups. I'm in Silicon Valley, so you can't help but do that. But I was the COO of a social networking company for teen girls that was bought by Stardoll. I was the CTO of an out-of-home advertising company for sports called In Stadium that was bought by Gimbal. And most recent and most relevant to what I do now, I was the founder and CEO of a blockchain ticketing company called Upgraded that was acquired by Live Nation and Ticketmaster back in 2018. And sort of a little bit of background on like how I got to Credenza and what Credenza is. While I was working on the blockchain, and particularly with blockchain ticketing, with Upgraded, with Ticketmaster, one of the things that I knew as a limitation of what we were doing with Upgraded was we were only looking at the ticketing behavior and the tickets of the user. And ultimately, whether you're a sports fan, whether you're a music fan, there's so much more nuance and there's so many more facets to your fandom than simply whether you physically attend a game. Do you buy the merchandise? Do you buy concessions when you go to the game? Are you paying attention on TV or on websites or things like that? And all that data had an opportunity to find itself in the blockchain. And ultimately, I was at Ticketmaster. Ticketmaster focused on tickets. It wasn't FanMaster, as I always like to say. And so after I left Ticketmaster during the pandemic, I took a little bit of time. I actually got away from blockchain for a while. My running joke is that everybody called me Mr. Blockchain and the blockchain guy, and enough was enough, and I had to do other things. And then 2021 happened, the crypto boom, or the crypto spring, the NFT boom, decentralized finance became a thing, and I realized it was time to go back to blockchain. But I thought back to some of the things that I'd been thinking when I was in ticketing, and I said, how do we use the blockchain in a meaningful way that allows us to accumulate not only assets, which everybody thinks about with the blockchain, like tokens or cryptocurrency or NFTs, but also thinking about attributes, things that you can associate with this wallet, this agnostic identity. And we could associate that you were a AAA member, an Amex member, alum of Cornell University like I am, or something like that. How do we attach that to that wallet identity? And how do we also capture actions and almost to create it like a unique version of a customer data platform, what we like to now call a data synchronization platform? And so that's what began Credenza. It started a little bit from NFTs aren't enough. There's so much more to the platform. And now we ourselves have become an extended platform to allow for this use of wallets as a universal identity and the data between the assets, attributes, and actions that associate it with it, that create this next generation of how people manage their identities and their profiles across the internet.
And I'd love to dive deeper on that. So you went from this non-blockchain world and were fascinated by blockchain technology from what it sounds like. Can you share like more why? Like why is it interesting and why you're dedicating now your entire business to bringing that in?
Yeah. If you had asked me, I found the blockchain about 11 years ago. It was 2013 when it was first introduced to me. It was a company that was recruiting me and they said, are you interested in a blockchain role? I said, yes. I hung up the phone. I said, what's a blockchain? And went and I did research on it. And I've talked about this to a lot of people in the past, but it was one of the rare times in my life that I had a true epiphany moment. I was reading a book talking about blockchain and the way the public key infrastructure worked, and this idea that identity wasn't defined by Sandy at Credenza3.com and Roy at Decommerce.com. It was identified by math, this concept of a public key and a private key that had no personally identifiable information, but could theoretically work anywhere. And I stopped for a second. I literally put the Kindle down and I said, if this ever takes off, this will change the world. This will change the way the internet runs. And I've always kind of had that in the back of my mind, whether it was 2 years later when I quit my job to go start a blockchain ticketing company, or I took my little little sabbatical when I went away from it. But when I came back to it this time, I still believed in the fact that it's like, you know what, the internet is just this series of fiefdoms. If you think about it, it's technically the protocols are all common, but what happens when we go to one site versus another site, we create these new identities, creating this seamless interaction of identity across all the different places. Some people have tried it. When I was at Microsoft, we had a concept called Hailstorm, which eventually became My Microsoft and the My services. They tried, it wasn't quite ready for it then. And again, it was going to be owned by Microsoft and people feared that. There's been Facebook logins and Google logins, but the idea that something that is held by no one that's running on these decentralized networks, that changes everything. And I knew that I wanted to dedicate my career to be a part of that.
And that, that technical aspect, and you got fascinated by the technical components. Now, if we break it down and think more in the world that you're, so familiar with right now, in the sports world, entertainment, music, all of that, how does that actually work in the real world? Why does it make sense to use this in the real world?
Yeah. And for us, we have aspirations to be across all different sorts of worlds, but we start with the sports world. And if you see a lot of our marketing and everything, we look like we're a sports company, and we are, because sports is the best place for it. And the reason is that if you are a fan of sports, and if you're not, you can slide music in as sort of a proxy, and music has some elements too. But your fandom to sports goes beyond simply whether you show up NFL stadium on 10 given Sundays throughout a season, right? There's also the games that are on the road. There's also the other games of your fantasy football fandom. There's also the off season, the draft, the playoffs, the Super Bowl. There's just, being a fan of the National Football League is a 365-day a year, or certainly 300-day a year proposition. It's not just about the 17 Sundays and the 10 Sundays that you're at home. And the idea of creating this extended idea on what different football fans are, how they interact. Are you a passive fan? Are you a casual fan? Are you an active fan? Or are you a fanatic, right? And this idea isn't just proven by whether you show up on Sundays or not. I always like to say, and anybody who knows me knows that I'm a very, very big Baltimore Orioles fan. Even though I live 3,000 miles away, I am just fanatical. It's beyond belief. I can't go to very many games. I still manage to go to way too many games, as my wife would tell me, but I don't go to nearly enough compared to other people. The fact that I watch 150 games a year on MLB TV, the fact that I participate on social networks or things like that, that I'm a part of this community that is Oriole fans, that right now they're going through a rough stretch, that makes me a different target. I hate using that word, but it's kind of what it is. That makes me a different customer to the Baltimore Orioles than, say, someone who happens to be in Baltimore, lives close to Camden Yards where they play, and goes to 20 games a year. I'm actually somebody that can be a lot more monetizable. And now that sports has gone more global, and you have millions of EPL fans in the US and this growing number of NFL and NBA fans overseas, this becomes more and more important to recognize that the virtual aspect of the community of fandom is kind of brought up in the realization that there's a lot of economic upside in catering to these fans.
100%. I think this is also something that we hear when we talk to clubs, where it's a lot about the tickets, and it's a super important revenue source, of course. But then there's also this whole fandom nationally, but even globally. Super
That's right.
fans that might be all around the world. So how does, let's say, blockchain help, and data in general help, to understand them better and to cater to them better?
The way we look at blockchain, the important part of the distinction between where I think blockchain has traditionally found itself and where we find ourselves is that, in the first, I kind of feel like we're in the V3 of blockchain. We're about to reach the V3 of blockchain, and Credenza specifically wants to be a big part of it. V1 was cryptocurrency. Not cryptocurrency as transactional mechanisms, but as speculative mechanisms. I bought Bitcoin at 10,000. It's going to go to 20,000. The second wave was NFTs, and no one necessarily 100% knew what they were buying. They just knew that you were almost playing like a stock market game. So I'm going to buy something and it's going to go up higher. Blockchain was the star in each of those cases. We see the blockchain as plumbing. We see it as a mechanism to bring all these different components of the fandom together, whether it's your viewing habits on TV, your attendance habits at the venue, your merchandise habits, and the swath of jerseys that I have in my closet that, again, my wife would probably pick on me for, all these different ways that we interact with the brand. In traditional senses, I always say, with Credenza, it's like, how are we better tomorrow than we were yesterday? Every technology company should ask ourselves that. Well, yesterday, or, sort of the status quo on what technology is right now, we have these fiefdoms of our relationship with the team. In the case of the Baltimore Orioles sell me tickets, they sell me concessions, they sell me merchandise, but in reality, They sell me tickets through tickets.com. They sell me concessions through Aramark or Levy or whoever their concessionaire is. They sell me merchandise through Fanatics. And I am three separate customers in those cases, even though it is one entity, the Baltimore Orioles, that is the rights holder of our relationship. The question is, how do you get more consistency? How do the Orioles not only take better care of that relationship and understand it better, but how do they allow Fanatics and tickets.com and Aramark or Levy to be better in their ability to service me on their behalf? Because if their partners don't look good, they don't look good. What we're trying to do is empower basically the ecosystem to create a better experience, because now we have a more holistic view of the customer across all these different touch points. We can bring that context to bear with every subsequent touch point.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me, definitely. And also the other topic that you brought up now a few times also is the fan, or in a bigger way, the community. So I wanted to ask you what community means to you and how you define that.
We were chatting a little bit right before the session, and I was sharing that for me, online communities are really important to me. Going back about 20 years ago, I spent 6 years at Microsoft. The last 3 years, I ran the Microsoft Community Technologies team. So we ran the Microsoft blogs, the Microsoft forums. I actually co-founded a site called Codeplex, which was sort of what now people would see as GitHub, but it was a code sharing site. And this idea of creating communities, these group of not necessarily even like-minded individuals, but people who have common interests, affinities of interest, that they care, they're passionate, they're curious about certain places, and you give them room to interact, you give them room to converse, to have conversations that even the host of the conversations, in this case, it was the Microsoft developer division, could never even imagine these conversations, because it's the customers who are experiencing those products together. And in some cases, it's Q&A. Can somebody help me with this? I need some help. In other cases, like, I think the idea of generics in C# isn't done right. Oh, really? Why? And you have this back and forth that, when respectful, and of course, a lot of social networks, it isn't always respectful politically, but when it's respectful, it opens eyes. It brings up new experiences. It allows people to share and grow with one another. And you also start identifying those people within the community that are the most important people in the community, right? I always think about Malcolm Gladwell and, the tipping point, and the idea of like the mavens and the salespeople and the connectors. And it's like allowing that to happen in an environment where you're not separated by borders, which is online. That was happening 20 years ago. And there's been a huge evolution in the way we all lean in. We've all become more and more active in contributing, not just reading in the systems, but that's still going to be something that was a big deal 20 years ago. And it's going to be a big deal 20 years from now.
And within, 20 years ago to now, what we see, and I'd love to get your take on that, is that around 20 years ago, like you said, there were forums, there were places where people could already exchange and all of that, which might have been even proprietary at that point, different places, quite decentralized. And then with networks, social media networks, it just became very convenient, I would say. And then at some point also with all these network effects of having one place to be able to reach more people. So it became more convenient, easy to have those places in a centralized spot, aka social media platforms.
Right.
Now, over the past 5-7 years, as organic reach has just been declining, and I think also companies, organizations, all of that have become more probably educated on what data is and means and what can be done with it. There is kind of this, what's next, right? This doesn't feel sustainable. Organic reach is down. I don't know what happens to my data. What do you see happen there?
We're at a very interesting inflection point in how communities operate right now and where they're going. And I think everything you're talking about is touching on that, because, if you think about all the parties that are involved, whether it's the participants in the community or the de facto host of the community, whether it's on their site or whether it's about their product, ultimately, there's a little bit of an ownership play that kind of goes away, and it gets a little tricky. Going back to my, 20 years ago, 20 years goes in a blink of an eye. But one of the beautiful things about what I felt like we did at Microsoft was, by hosting the conversations, by actually being engaged and kind of building up this understanding of each individual customer, what we also were able to do is use it as a recruitment platform for people who ultimately could be we had a number of programs. One was called the Microsoft Regional Directors, people in certain areas that would take leadership roles as customers, but would take leadership roles as proxies within our ecosystem. We also have this concept called the Most Valuable Professional, the MVP program, that was wildly successful. Well, how do you find those MVPs? Well, Well, you build that richer relationship because you own the relationship. You see how they're operating in the community and how they're operating with the other aspects of your online properties. And you build this rich understanding of a customer. When it gets co-opted by these centralized social networks that basically munch things together, I think there's two things that happen that are very unfortunate. Number one, and this is very much to your point, the data gets lost, right? That there's a lost in translation when it comes over to the centralized world. And a lot of that doesn't necessarily leak back in a meaningful way, both for the host, in this case, it would have been Microsoft, but also for the user, right? The other part is that there's also a little bit of a lack of focus, right? In a world where we have 50 million things coming at us once, I'm an Instagram user, right? But it's funny to see the different things that pop up on my Instagram, right? It's like, oh, there's my friend, and there's my wife, and there's the Baltimore Orioles, and there's LeBron James, and there's, some other influencer, right? And if you think, I can only imagine, and I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist or anything, but what that does to the brain to zigzag and all these other things. And sometimes I just want to talk about baseball, or sometimes I just want to talk about blockchain, or sometimes I just want to do something, on a group chat with my family, right? Like that idea of getting a little bit more focused, that idea of having a richer data information. And then also, and this comes back to what Credenza sees as opportunistic, is the idea of also bringing all the other context of that conversation. So not only is it about, let's just use where I was in Microsoft, not only is it about the relationship that I have with Microsoft in the fact that I am a .NET developer, but also the idea that other aspects and other contexts from other partners or other people related to Microsoft, other entities related to Microsoft, suddenly to provide more context, like, no, this guy is really smart, elevate his comments to the top because he's a 20-year developer and he works on stuff and he's one of the most noted members of the community and he's actually buying the product. I always think about Amazon. Sometimes when you read a review, it's like they have to say, like, this person actually did buy the product, right? You need to validate that user just with the purchase. So it's like, it's not some guy, making fun of a book and he's never even read the book. It's like, no, this person at least bought the book. So there is some credibility. How do you make that richer? How do you bring context to those conversations? And then how do you manage that data so that you have that direct relationship with your customer and you don't let it get co-opted by a third party?
Yeah, and I think this is something where we see that some organizations, they already see that they don't know, right? So some have now come to realize that actually they know a lot of things probably on the purchasing level if it's direct to consumer, right? If they can sell, let's say, tickets directly or merchandise directly. But if it goes through third parties, also there is no clear path. But then when it comes to engagement and social interactions and what are people talking about, it's a black box. I mean, you can look through it on the site manually, you can read through the comments and try to tie them together. But if you're a bit more of a scaled organization, it becomes impossible to match this information with your purchasing information and weigh it to say, oh, this person is actually spending with us and commenting. Let's cater to that person.
It almost feels like any data in a vacuum without any other supporting data or related data is very uninteresting, right? This idea that it's like, okay, you made a comment on whether it's on a traditional social network or on a commerce or on a commercial site like an Amazon or a dedicated community, you made a comment. That comment by itself can be great or it can't be great. Maybe it's just like, this sucks, right? Or something that's completely unconstructive and useless, or I thought this book was great for this reason. When you add every additional layer, every additional data point about that user, about the other behaviors, about all those other different things, that's what gets really valuable. The same way that when you talk about like some of these entities have the ability, like in our world with sports, they have the ability to sell tickets. Well, not all tickets are the same. I'll give a music example because it's very relevant to today. So tonight I'm going to a concert. I'm going to see Green Day. I have been a Green Day fan for 30 years, literally 1994. I was in college. I was the first of my friends to discover them. This is the first time I'm seeing them live. I'm beyond ecstatic. I am bringing my 16-year-old daughter, who clearly was not alive 30 years ago, or even 20 years ago when American Idiot came out, which is the other album that they're doing. It's a shame that Green Day doesn't realize how huge a fan I am, how often I listened to Dookie when it first came out 30 years ago, how often I listened to American Idiot 20 years ago. There's no context on that ticketing purchase, right? In the future, I believe there can be. In the future, I do believe there can be this lineage between me commenting about how much I love Green Day. I wrote this ode to Green Day 20 years ago. I remember the blog post when American Idiot came out in the middle of the election cycle in 2004. That context coming to that that relationship. It's not just me buying a ticket because I have nothing better to do on a Friday night. I've been planning for this for months. Like I saw this and it's at Oracle Park and it's so exciting. And, my daughter and I were planning this and I got my daughter to go. She actually loves American Idiot, even though she's 16, right? Like I couldn't be more excited. I'm sure I'm going to sit next to somebody else who's probably going to talk through the whole thing or is just there to see the Smashing Pumpkins, who I also love, but are playing right before. And they may leave right before Green Day comes on because they don't care about Green Day. That's important. That's important for the Pumpkins to know. That's important for Green Day to know. That's important for Oracle Park to know. It's important for Ticketmaster to know. It's important for Live Nation to know. How do we bring more context to any purchase? Because a purchase by itself, two people buying the same ticket. And I always think about this when I go to an Orioles game, going back to my baseball love, and the people behind me aren't paying attention to the game. And I'm like riveted and fixated. Sometimes I go by myself because I don't want to be bothered with human interaction when I'm focused on the game. I'm a different fan, right? And the understanding of that comes through when you see how I operate on Twitter and ideally on some of the other Orioles websites that I actually kind of participate with. You see that it's like, wow, this guy's written 10,000 tweets in 10 years. He's a fan, right? And that's important for the Orioles to know. It's important for Major League Baseball to know. It's important for anybody, tickets.com, Fanatics, anybody to know, because that's how they can service me better.
I think that's a great example. And how, let's say, to paint that picture in the future, how would a brand, a sports club, set up their structure and know their community, know their fans? What needs to be in place to be able to know that?
When we talk, a lot of people, when we present Credenza, they're kind of like, oh, you're a loyalty program. I'm like, first of all, and especially when I talk in sports, I'm like, sports teams should never have loyalty programs because sports fans are notoriously loyal almost to a fault, right? You're a diehard Cubs fan, you're a diehard Red Sox fan, whatever else it might be. I like to use the terms incentives and rewards. And the idea of being in a situation where you create this unification across all these different touch points and you properly reward people for their participation. So that requires two things. Number one, how do you create that connectivity to the customer in all the places where they are interacting with your brand? How do you take that ownership back? How do you provide that? How do you capture all those interactions in a meaningful way that you realize that this isn't just Sandy Khaund, this is Sandy Khaund, big Orioles fan. But then the second part of it is that how do you reward people for doing those things, for actually engaging, for being a more part of the community, for saying, we see you, we recognize you, right? One of the things that I had a student do a project a couple of years ago because we were thinking about season ticket holders and what's called premier seat license holders, which are people who buy the right to buy season tickets. And he was an MBA student. He kind of went sort of undercover, just asking like, hey, I'm thinking about buying it. What do you like about it? What do you not like about it? And every single person that complained about spending all this money is the team doesn't see me. They don't treat me special. I spent all this money and they're just treating me like any other fan, right? And that one's easy, right? Somebody gives you thousands of dollars, treat them special. But what about the person that not only gives thousands of dollars, but is excited about you and talking about you in different places and wears your team shirt, not only on game days, but on draft day and other things like that? How do you capture that? How do you kind of own that relationship? And how do you, a term that we use quite a bit is hyper-personalization. Hyper-personalization says it's not just about show me all the 50-something Green Day fans in the Bay Area that go to live shows. It's like, show me all the people that have been watching, listening for 30 years and goes to concerts, all this other stuff. You can do something where even demographically, one of my favorite memes that's out there is that they have a picture of Ozzy Osbourne, the crazy rocker of years ago, and Prince Charles, or now I believe King Charles. And they're basically like 60-something male, born in Europe, wealthy. They're the same person if you try to do it from a demographic perspective, but very clearly from their actions, they've led very, very different lives and they're very, very different people, right? Like, how do you start building that richer sort of target? How do you, and again, it's not in a way to be creepy. In fact, one of the things that I love about the way Credenza does things is a kind of a shameless plug for us is that it's not Roy at Decommerce.com or Sandy at Credenza3.com or anything like that. You're known by your public key. You are known by your hexadecimal address, which has no personally identifiable information. Because the truth is that whether it's the Baltimore Orioles or Green Day, they don't really care that I'm Sandy. I'd like to think that they do, but they don't. What they care is that I have a couple of dollars, and when I like to spend my couple of dollars, I like to spend it on baseball, and I like to spend it on 90s punk music, right? Like, and that's the important part. It's not who I am, it's what I do. We worry about privacy because it's like, oh, I don't want anybody to know that I'm Sandy and I live in this part of California or whatever. That's unimportant when it really comes to the brands. We just want to know you better so that we can treat you better and recognize you really care about us and we appreciate that. And we're going to take care of you in the same way. What that means is capturing as much of the data as possible while being as respectful as possible to the privacy wishes of the audience. And that's what we think we can do with blockchain. That's what we're trying to do with Credenza. That's the doors that we're opening up to create this more holistic view of a customer, keeping more of what's important and trying to reject a lot of the stuff that not only isn't important, but kind of acts as almost a vulnerability in the way that most businesses process data.
And this is exactly why we started talking so much, and I think where we complement each other so well. And on that community level, what do you, community level, this rich data that you were talking about, where do you see those sports communities evolve towards? Like if we think in terms of this fans, followers of the past, 10, 15 years, what do you see happen over the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, I think there's richer conversations that are going to continue to happen. I think one of the things, and this is just a little bit of an aside about sports in general and what sports is going through, because sports is going through a very interesting transitional phase on a lot of levels. From the way people consume content, it's happening more and more online. I think we used to talk about appointment viewing that would happen on ESPN, on our DirecTV or Dish TV or Comcast. And now it's, last night's game between the New England Patriots and the New York Jets was on Amazon Prime, right? So suddenly the games are moving where they're integrated to digital integration. What that does is that the ability to kind of integrate community into even the consumption of the content becomes a lot richer. And the idea of watching the game, and while I'm watching the game, if I was a Jets fan and I wanted to tweet about the game and look at it's great, Aaron Rodgers is so great, how do we create that more holistic experience? How is the TV set as aware, or not even the TV set, actually it was my TV that I used it, but getting a digital feed, how is that aware that I'm Sandy, the same, when I'm participating in a community, in my Jets community, and the Jets on the screen are able to reward me in my consumption while I'm actually publishing, right? This idea of creating a better kinship, this interconnected standpoint. Whenever we talk about sports, we always say it's ticketing, sponsorship, concession, merchandise, content rights, and betting, betting, whether it's fantasy betting, whether it's betting where allowed. All those things have an opportunity to be much more tightly integrated. And the beauty and the reason why obviously we're big Decommerce fans and community is so important is that ultimately the community is the most nuanced way in how someone can show their support of a team, of a league, of a player, right? If I am a big Shohei Ohtani fan, the baseball player who had probably one of the greatest single games in history to complete one of the most successful seasons in history, I'm going to mention something about him. And the Dodgers should know that. Major League Baseball should know that I have mad respect for Shohei Ohtani, right? How do we do that? And then how do we give instant feedback in those things? How do we recognize saying, boy, you're a big fan. We're going to give you a discount on a shirt. We're going to kind of take care of you. We're going to incentivize you to continue to operate. We're going to reward you for your past operations. I think community is at the crux of that because, again, buying a ticket can be the same thing. My 16-year-old daughter and I both have tickets, right? But we are very different in our fandom of Green Day. How do we get a little bit more nuance? Community is the greatest thing because when you have the free form ability to just talk about anything and you choose to spend your time to talk about Shohei Ohtani or Aaron Rodgers or whatever else it might be, that allows us to better target it where we can change the consumption experience of what you're watching on TV. We can change some of the groups and some of the things you have access to when it's not the game going on. I see a completely different future. And again, all of that being respectful to the fact that it's still you that's operating, but it's less about it being Roy or Sandy. And it's just, Jets fan 1 or Ohtani fan 2. And we're just operating with some level of accountability because it is our identity, but also some level of anonymity or what I like to call pseudonymity about who we are so that, it's still privacy respectful at a time when that gets more and more important as, digital enters our lives more and more.
100%. And what's your answer on how to start this journey to move from this ticket or purchase focused data to a more user fan focused data? What's the first step?
particularly with Credenza, because this is kind of our raison d'etre, is this idea of creating a single sign-on, this universal identity that's consistent with the brand. So it's almost like to own the relationship with the fan, you need to create a consistent way of addressing the fan on all these other different touch points that are there. So in the specific case of Credenza, again, another shameless plug, but we have this concept of a single sign-on identity that can still be tied to old school single sign-on identities like Google or Facebook. We even have Ticketmaster and Spotify authentication, but you can also create your own, right? We're big fans of the passwordless authentication because I am in my early 50s. I don't remember things as well, so it's just easier to flip me 4 digits and I just type them in, and I'm always going to be Sandy Credenza 3. But then what that does, that creates a bridge to this blockchain identity. And the important distinction from people who've been in the crypto world and the NFT world is that we're not talking about a MetaMask filter. It is ostensibly a custodial wallet, although you have the ability to pull the credentials off. We do allow that if you want to manage them yourself. We do support MetaMask if any of our clients want MetaMask support. But ultimately, once you are that individual, once the team has allowed you to become this universal identity across all these different places, then that team now has the ability to work with its partners, its sponsors, its vendors, its whole ecosystem to say, hey, when you authenticate with somebody, link over to this other identity. And now we're actually going to be able to credit that user for all the different activities that they do. And then we start building that rich data set. And then with different vendors, and we've done this with the St. Louis Blues specifically, is that we've worked with a number of vendors to say, here's how we'd like the data in, here's how you can get the data back. In fact, the conversations you and I have had is that we'd love to have as much data as possible about who's participating in what way in your communities, but there may be ways that you can reward people because they just, went out and spent $100 on an authentic jersey, and you want to recognize them, maybe do something better for them in the community or give them a star or whatever else it might be. But how do you create this give and take? And I think if you are a rights holder, if you're a team, if you're a league, if you're an athlete, you want to understand what are the behaviors you want to incentivize? What are the strategies that you care about? What are you trying to encourage? Do you want people who are participating in the community, but they don't go to games? You can get them to come to a game. I always like to joke when I talk to the St. Louis Blues that every time I go to a hockey game physically, I forget how much I love going to a physical hockey game. It just, I didn't go for a number of years after the pandemic. I'm like, it's hockey. And then you go back, it's like, this is just great, right? Like there's nothing like live hockey. How do you get someone who's never been to a game to go to a game? How do you get someone who goes to a game with his drinking buddies to say, hey, next time take your family, we're family friendly? Or the one that goes with his family say, hey, come back with your drinking buddies next time. There's a lot of different ways to go and incentivize the right behavior, but it starts by knowing that customer, and that knowing the customer starts from that identity that is canonical across all these different touch points, whether it's in venue, whether it's online, whether it's in a virtual world or a 3D world, like our partners at Mantis XR who can create a virtual locker room, but that virtual locker room also knows that you've been in the real locker room and you've also been online doing a lot of things as well. So creating this unified identity, that's the first step, and it opens the door to everything else.
That's awesome. I'd say the first step is even like reaching out to you and having that first conversation. Where can people find you?
The easiest way, Sandy at credenza3.com. I have a very unique name, Sandy Khaund, Khaund. So finding me on LinkedIn is pretty easy as well. But yeah, happy to have conversations. And I know the blockchain can be scary for a lot of people. I was literally watching a Seth Meyers last night where he's joking about trying to get explained blockchain. He can never understand it. I think I do an okay job, so I have no problem. I've educated a lot of people over the years. It's been a 9-year love affair, and hopefully it will continue on. But happy to be very patient with people, because the first step is education and recognizing what happened with crypto, what happened with NFTs. This isn't your father's blockchain. This is something very different, and we're very excited about what we're doing here.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Sandy. Looking forward to continuing the conversation. It's been fascinating. So thanks so much for sharing all of this.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. This was a lot of fun.